Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for attending the Institute of Politics' latest event, Who Votes in 2024? Literally Half the World. My name is Abby Langer, and I'm a first-year prospective global studies major in the college from Indianapolis. I'm also a Speaker Series event ambassador for the IOP. I'm thrilled to introduce you to tonight's panelists, who will be discussing the numerous elections occurring around the world in 2024, and drawing on their own personal experiences to examine the critical impacts these elections may have across the globe. Tonight's panel features Nicole Bibin-Sadaka, Admiral Harry B. Harris Jr., Crystal Orderson, and Sadia Sintu. Nicole Bibin-Sadaka is the Executive Vice President at Freedom House, an organization working to promote democratic change internationally and dedicated towards expanding freedom around the world by focusing on political rights and civil liberties. She served for 10 years in the U.S. Department of State, working to advance human rights and democracy, and then opened and directed the International Republican Institute's local governance program in Ecuador. Admiral Harry B. Harris Jr. served as a commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet from 2013 to 2015, and was then appointed by President Obama to serve as the commander of the U.S. Pacific Command before being appointed as U.S. Ambassador to South Korea in 2018. He served in every geographic combatant command region and participated in major operations such as Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Willing Spirit, and Odyssey Dawn. He has logged over 4,000 flight hours and received numerous awards, including the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, and the State Department's Distinguished Honor Award. Crystal Orderson is a South African journalist who has spent 2 decades reporting on socioeconomic issues and elections in South Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. Reporting for several local and international media outlets, including BBC and Al Jazeera, Orderson is a regular analyst on local media on African politics. She was the first West African bureau chief for the South African Broadcasting Corporation and has worked alongside multiple non-governmental organizations to address social and political issues. Moderating this discussion tonight is Sadia Sintu, founding executive director of the Center for Effective Government here at UChicago. She served in a variety of strategic roles in the public and private sectors, including director of the UChicago Civic Leadership Academy, where she worked as a lead strategist on matters surrounding the execution and growth of the academy across the university. She is also a fellow in the second class of the Civil Society Fellowship, a partnership of the Anti-Defamation League and the Aspen Institute, and a member of the Aspen Global Leadership Network. Please remember to silence and turn off your cell phones. Towards the end of this event, a microphone will be placed in the audience for a Q&A session. Please line up and remember that priority for the first questions goes to students. Please visit the IOP's website for information on further Speaker Series events, including Illinois Bails on Cash Bail, Public Safety Beyond Jails on February 19th at 12 p.m., and Denmark-U.S. Relations and Climate Diplomacy on February 20th at 3:30 p.m. Additionally, check the IOP website for a new batch of student internships launching this Friday. We'll have a number of internships related to the 2024 U.S. election, including an open position with UChicago Votes. Food will be served upstairs at the end of the event. Finally, I'd like to invite you all to give a warm welcome to Nicole Bibin-Sadaka, Admiral Harry B. Harris Jr., Crystal Orderson, and Sadia Sintu. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby, and thank you to the team at IOP and CEG for putting together this conversation. Thank you to all of you for attending tonight. So as the event title suggests, who votes in 2024? Literally half of the world. 2024 is not just a mega election year, it is perhaps the election year. So this year, an estimated 4 billion people from over 60 countries, almost half of the world's population, will head to polls in national elections. In fact, more people will have the opportunity to vote in 2024 than in any previous year. Yet, this does not necessarily mean that we have an explosion of democracy. Just last week, Pakistanis, including many of my own family members, headed to the polls in a much-watched election. Pakistan's Tehreek-e-Insaf, PTI, the party of former Prime Minister Imran Khan, who was removed from office in 2022, subverted expectations by emerging as the largest political force in spite of an election ban. An actual headline, not a meme, from The Economist yesterday reads, Pakistan's voters tell the generals where to put it. So the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to try to make sense of this election and other elections as well. And with so many elections happening around the world, frankly, it's hard to keep track of them all, but we're very, very lucky to have this incredibly well-informed, well-versed experts who will help us better understand these elections, who the key players are, why it matters, and why these elections what they might signal about democracy worldwide. One quick note, we know there's also a mega election here in the United States, but for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to focus on some of the elections that are happening abroad. And in addition to that, there is an election that's happening in India that IOP will host an event about later in the spring, so our focus will not include the US and India. So with that, Nicole, I want to come to you first. In a few weeks, Freedom House will release its 2024 Freedom in the World report. Despite my best attempts, you have not leaked the report to me. But tell us a little bit about Freedom House, and tell us specifically what is Freedom House paying attention to as we head into this election year.
Excellent. Thank you, Sadia. First, let me just say thank you to the Center for Effective Governance and the Institute of Politics and UChicago as a whole for hosting us. It's wonderful to be able to talk about these issues. At Freedom House, we are focused on the fact that we're in our 17th year. In 2 weeks, we'll figure out whether that's the 18th year or whether it's turned around, but the 17th year of democratic decline, which means that there are more countries in which there is a regression of the political and civil rights of individuals than there are countries where it is progressing. And that's we're at a turning point really, because we really know how crucial this decline is and the impact on the lives of individuals. But it is an election year for half of the world's population. And in many ways, we're watching the positives and the negatives. The positives really are, this is a tangible way that people are involved in democracy. It is a way that people feel that their voice can be heard in a very tangible and visible way. It is not the entirety of democracy, but it really is a way that people can get directly involved. It's also notable that of the elections that are coming up, some are held by dictators. And while that obviously is a sham in many places, Russia, Venezuela, other places, it is a sign, though, that there is still this democratic peer pressure. There's a desire, even on the part of the dictators of the world, to adhere to what is the source of legitimacy, which is tapping into the voice of people. And we also know that we've seen elections such as the one that happened in Poland, where undemocratic leaders are unseated. So these are not just elections where we think, well, we know it will come out and there's not much hope in any direction. We know that these are powerful opportunities. But there are also a lot of dangers. We know that some of the elections will be sham elections. There's no doubt. We expect that there will be political violence and undermining of elections in different places. We know that some free and fair elections will bring to power undemocratic leaders who on the day everything ran democratically, but then they enter office and will dismantle the very system that brought them to office. The last thing that we're really watching is the impact of AI and generative AI. We've seen in a report that we came out with last year 16 plus countries that have a significant impact due to the manipulation of images and to undemocratic forces using generative AI to undermine elections. So we are very hopeful because we know that there's a lot of change that is possible, and we know that the voice of people will be heard, but we also know that we're not out of the woods on this democratic decline.
As you think about some of the elections that are happening, which elections are you paying the most attention to, and why?
The two that you said we're not allowed to talk about are the ones that we're very focused on the US election, yes. And that's not only something that's impacting the United States, but it's also impacting the United States' foreign policy, which we know impacts a lot of countries. India is also, obviously, as a very large populist democracy that also has had some negative trends. But Mexico has a very important election coming up. South Africa has a very important election coming up. There are some really significant ones. We also know that there are some Russia, Iran, Venezuela. We expect all of those not to be free and fair, but we know those will be opportunities where there will be a lot of popular sentiment and a popular desire to have their voice heard, but it will most likely be met by dictators that have no interest in hearing it.
Thank you.
Yep.
Admiral Harris, Nicole just walked us through some of the global trends to pay attention to. It's true that some of these elections are going to have implications beyond their borders. I'm curious if you could share a little bit about the elections that Taiwan just held and what that means for Taiwan, but beyond that as well.
Sure. So thanks for the question, and thanks for having me here. This is not my normal area of expertise, but I'm glad to be here. I do think that 2024, we're facing an inflection point in the world. It's an important year. The scales of that inflection won't tip of its own accord, and it won't tip because of wishful thinking. It takes each of you to do your part, at minimum vote, and it takes organizations like the CEG and the work that you do to ensure that the elections over which you exercise some responsibility are done in a fair and free way. And it takes observers like Crystal here, international election observers who put their lives on the line in many cases to do their important work. So thank you for that. So to the question about Taiwan. So my opinion when I think about Taiwan is I think that they are it's a democratic nation, it's a global force for good, and it's an idea factory. So unlike most of the elections that we're going to be talking about during this session, and those that we're not supposed to talk about during this session, Taiwan had their elections. They had them on the 12th of January of this year, and the new president, or the president-elect, the new president will take office in May. It was a significant election, not only for Taiwan, but for its relationship with China, and therefore our relationship with China. So in Taiwan, there were three candidates, William Lai, L-A-I, who's the current vice president, a fellow named Ho, who is the mayor of New Taipei City, which is a KMT, a Kuomintang stronghold, and there was an independent third-party candidate named Ko. Lai won handily, though he did not win with an outright majority, but he won enough votes that he's the president-elect. Ho represents the DPP, the Democratic Party of Taiwan, and again, he's the sitting vice president to Tsai Ing-wen. China obviously opposed Lai's candidacy. They favored Ho as a member of the KMT, the Kuomintang, and they felt that Lai, who has a reputation for pro-independence, would take Taiwan to the limit and perhaps cross that imaginary point of no return by declaring independence. Lai has assured us, the United States and China, that he will not declare independence and that he'll govern effectively. I think that Lai's election is a good sign for Taiwan, and it moves them in the right direction. And I think his first commentary after the election was one offering an olive branch to the PRC, to China. China's initial reaction was one of belligerence. They threatened some economic action, they threatened some diplomatic action, and they questioned the legitimacy of the election. But I think they've gotten over that now. And a surprise to many observers, including me, the Chinese did not react in a belligerent military way, similar to the way they reacted after Speaker Pelosi visited Taiwan 2 years ago. So that's a positive sign, and I think only time will tell. But I think our relationship with Taiwan will continue to be improving, continue to be on the upswing, and I think that we can look forward to a good presidency by President Lai.
And I should clarify, we can't talk about the U.S. and India, but there will be events about the U.S. and India. So with that, Admiral Harris, regarding Taiwan, I wonder if you can speak a little bit to, do you see elements of that election and the results coming into the 2024 U.S. election? And if so, how?
Well, I mean, we're seeing it play out now, right? I mean, the Senate just passed a $95 billion aid package, primarily to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, roughly in that order of magnitude. So we have a relationship with Taiwan that's governed by the law. It's not governed by politics, it's governed by the law. which is the Taiwan Relations Act. We don't have a diplomatic relationship with Taiwan, but if it were not for the U.S. Congress back in the late 70s, early 80s, Taiwan would not be where it is now. So we have that relationship with Taiwan, the Taiwan Relations Act, which obliges us to provide defensive weaponry for Taiwan's legitimate defensive needs, so that ultimately the relationship between Taiwan and the People's Republic of China can be resolved together without the use of force. And so that's where we are with that. It's already an election issue in the United States this year because our aid to Taiwan is lumped in with our aid to Israel and the aid package to Ukraine. So we're already seeing that play out. It passed the Senate handedly in a bipartisan way. And as you all know better than me, there are very few bipartisan issues in Washington these days, other than China. But this issue passed the Senate handedly. But that doesn't mean it'll get through the House. And that's where the challenge is now for those who support aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, as I do.
Thank you. Crystal, 18 of the 2024 elections are in Africa, and I want us to focus in on two of them, Senegal and South Africa. But let's start with Senegal. So Senegal's election was just postponed until December. Senegal has long been a pillar of stability and democracy in West Africa. Unlike many other countries in the region, it has avoided civil wars and coups and has, for the most part, held a largely peaceful and democratic transition of power. Up until now, it has never delayed an election. Can you speak to what forces internally have allowed for this to happen?
Thank you, Sadia, and thank you to IOP for the invite. I traveled 26 hours to get here, so looking forward to the engagement. So Senegal, I feel deeply personal about Senegal because it's the first West African country I went to. I lived there for 3 years. I engaged with activists. I traveled the length and breadth of the country and admired Senegal's democracy and robustness in terms of the judiciary, the media, civil society, and more importantly, its people. And so when Macky Sall last week took to national television in an address and announced the indefinite postponement of an election that was supposed to take place in 12 days' time, it shocked everyone. But when I engaged with my activist friends, they were actually not surprised by it because there's been certain signs along the way over the past few months that we've seen. Firstly, certain candidates having been excluded, the court, barring people from entering the presidential race, the kind of ruling elite, which Macky Sall forms part of. They've not been able to identify a candidate that has the charisma to actually bring Senegalese behind them, and they were not guaranteed, in my opinion, a second definite term. And then we've seen the emergence of new opposition candidates, articulate, Osman Soko, a former tax commissioner from the north of the country, emerging, being able to bring an opposition movement behind him, and he was excluded from the poll. And so all of these factors combined. And then, of course, Senegal, as you rightly pointed out, a beacon of stability in a region that we've seen coups d'etats happening. We've seen just 3 of Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger saying goodbye to the regional body. And so growing instability in that region. And so we really need a stable Senegal. And so the fact that Parliament then eventually, after riot police went out and beat activists on the streets of Dakar, the election was postponed until December. In my view, it is a serious regression, and it's bad news for West Africa, and it's bad news for Africa. And the fact that the election has been postponed until December. And so in my analysis, Macky Sall is not going to survive. We've seen today young people out on the streets, and that's not going to stop. We've always had, Nicole, robust activism in Dakar, in Senegal. We saw it during Abdoulaye Wade when he wanted to stay in power. We saw when he wanted to bring his son Karim Wade into power. And so I would predict that Macky Sall's days are numbered, and what he's done it's an indictment to the Senegalese people, it's an indictment to Senegal's democracy, and frankly, an insult to the people of Senegal that have always prided themselves as a beacon of stability in a region that can be pretty rough. And so I do foresee, we've not seen the African Union come out quite strongly against Macky Sall as compared to when we've had the coup d'etat in Burkina Faso or in Mali. And so I do expect in the coming days that the African Union will issue that kind of strongly worded statement. But I think ultimately, I do believe that Senegalese have always taken pride in their democracy. It didn't just arrive. And I do foresee that we're going to see destabilization in the coming weeks in Dakar.
This is super helpful, and it takes us back to sort of an earlier point we were making around when these elections go beyond their borders. Nicole, I wonder if you could weigh in on this. When democracies that are mostly stable, I don't want to say advanced democracies, but stable democracies falter in a region, what does that mean? And I know you've spoken to this a little bit, but I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more. What does that mean for democracy in that region overall?
Quite often it has a ripple effect, right? Because, and I think Senegal really is one of the cases of an anchor in many ways in West Africa. There is a sense of stability that's brought by countries which have had successive free and fair elections and peaceful transition of power. And when that is interrupted, by military, by a president choosing to postpone an election or violence, it has a ripple effect because people in the other countries then start to doubt, is democracy possible? Is elections possible? Is a change in my own country possible? And I think we have to look, democracy is just a system that we have to constantly nurture. It's like our health. You can't just assume that it will get to a point and stay. And so I really do believe in the resilience of activists and the resilience of the systems. But I do know that we have seen in many places, certainly in different parts of Africa, certainly in Latin America as well, when there is a regression or an interruption, it does have reverberations through the whole region.
And Crystal, you've predicted that what will likely happen in the Senegalese election. What do you see as happening more broadly in Africa as a result of that?
And I mean,
should that prediction come true?
Yeah, so I think as Nicole pointed out, it really, and if a country like Senegal is surrounded, its neighbors have all had coup d'etats. And so when that happens, people are like, but look, Senegal, beacon of stability. And that was really the big election in West Africa, at least Francophone Africa. And then, of course, Ghana is happening at the end of the year. But I, of course, have to turn to my own country, which is South Africa. We're celebrating 30 years of democracy this year. And we're also having an important election in a few months' time. In fact, Cyril Ramaphosa, the president, he had his last State of the Nation last week, Friday. So he now has 16 days to announce an election. So we estimate that election to take place around May. And so, of course, it's been Mandela's party really is going to face its most competitive election since the fall of apartheid in 1994. And there is a real possibility that it will get below 50% of the vote, which is an absolute sea change for us. I mean, and for me as a child of apartheid, saw change in a post-apartheid South Africa. The vote is a very personal thing because I got to vote for the first time in 1994 as an 18-year-old. And so we take it very serious. And so we have about 28 million people registered to vote. Unfortunately, we couldn't get a lot of young people out to vote because there's just been a lot of disillusionment with the ruling party. But until now, we have 356 registered political parties in South Africa. So one could say, Nicole, it's a sign of our robust democracy. But at the end of the day, it's 5 or 6, I think, political parties that are going to actually get people's vote. And so right now, as a voter, and not as a journalist, I face a real dilemma because who do I vote for? Are we ready as a young African nation, ready for multi-party democracy? Because we already know that democracy is messy, it's painful, it's a work in progress. Is South Africa, given our violent past, given our socioeconomic challenges, given our rainbow nation status, are we ready to embrace multi-party democracy? And will the African National Congress, Africa's oldest liberation movement, simply hand over. We in a neighborhood in Southern Africa where we've seen liberation movements do not give up. We look at Zimbabwe and ZANU-PF is still in power. We look at Mozambique. We look at Angola. We in a neighborhood where leaders haven't given up and liberation movements in particular haven't just handed over power. And so the real dilemma I face right now at this moment, is my country ready for multi-party democracy? And if so, what will that mean? Because we only know the African National Congress for the past 30 years, and will they respect the Constitution? And so as a voter, that's my real dilemma. As a journalist, I believe we have robust institutions. We have a Constitution, we have an independent judiciary, we have an independent media, active civil society, and I do think we have the checks and balances in place to ensure that if the ANC, doesn't get what they want or what they think they will get, that they will, I think, not graciously accept defeat, but I do think our institutions could possibly withhold any challenges.
So I came across a poll, Crystal, and I want to just share the stat with you, and hopefully you can help us unpack what this means. So in June 2023, in an Afrobarometer poll, some 70% of South Africans said that they are dissatisfied with the way democracy works. According to that same poll, few citizens see South Africa as a well-functioning democracy, and a growing majority would be willing to forego elections in favor of an unelected but efficient government that delivers security, jobs, and housing. What is that? So when we're thinking about the South African election, and you've shared personally as a South African, what's at stake with this election? And what does it say more broadly about just this experiment of democracy in South Africa?
Interestingly enough, Sadia, I was engaging with the two directors of Afrobarometer last week and Wednesday exactly on this issue, because there's another stat that people are willing to accept even a military dictator if they can have jobs, if they can have housing, if they can have just be protected, not have crime, etc. So, and so it means that the reality is that the Rainbow Nation, as some of our leaders had baptized us, it has simply not delivered. I mean, we have 1 in 3 young people do not have a job. We have some of the highest crime rates in the world. As a woman, the fact that Jennifer said to us, we can walk to our event, I cannot do that in my own hometown. That's the reality of ordinary South Africans. And there's a real sense and feeling that the African National Congress, the parent of the nation, so to say, has failed, and that there has to be some level of accountability to it. So, and so those are the realities. So right now, my family, my friends that have small businesses, they've not had power for up to 10 hours a day. How do you function that way? How do you grow an economy? How do you create jobs? How do you put food on the table when you wake up in the dark, you go to bed in the dark? And we put that in front of the door of the African National Congress, because the reality is there's been widespread corruption, there's been nepotism, there's been simply, as we call it in Africa, it was their time to eat, which of course was quite disappointing because there was the hope that the ANC would be different from the rest. And so that is at stake in terms of the kind of, as much as we've had certain socioeconomic gains, the fact that I'm sitting here is one of those gains, but we've regressed in terms of actual economic upliftment, actual change, and there's a lot of anger on the streets.
As we think about democracy delivering, Nicole, we were chatting about this earlier, and Admiral Harris, I invite you to join us in on this piece as well. We can have the elections happen, but if the elected parties are not able to deliver, what we're finding is that there is democratic backsliding, and people are starting to believe less in democracy. I wonder if you both can reflect on that. It could be about the US elections, it can be about elections abroad, but let's start with you, Nicole, and we'll move over to you, Admiral Harris.
Yeah, I think this question of democracy delivering is one of the hardest issues, and that one that we're wrestling with very much in the democracy support community. I think what I hear and what Crystal's saying, which I think captures so well what's happening in South Africa, but truly in many nations where they're 30 years, which seems like a long time, but it's also not that long for a democratic, the democratic development of a country. When you have leaders who do use corrupt practices. What's failing is not democracy. What's failing is the check and balance on a leader who is corrupt. Or I don't want to even say a leader who's corrupt, but corruption which is endemic in a system. And I think what we're seeing is in a global trend, there are a lot of countries in which corruption is a major problem. And that corruption is skimming off the tax dollars, the revenues, other sources of income for a nation, and basically channeling it towards the pockets of individuals as opposed to the benefit and the development of the human capital in the country. And so in many ways, what we have to do is look at that as the core problem, not necessarily democracy. I think the challenge when we hear the polls that say people would say, no, I'd rather have an unelected leader or a military dictatorship. I promise you, there is not milk and honey flowing in countries that have military dictators. And I think it's a sign that people want the system to deliver. It's not necessarily a sign that they don't want democracy, although that's how it's expressed. And so I think we really have to look both internally how there are better transparency mechanisms and checks on the corruption. I also think from an external, the international community has an opportunity to support democratic leaders in their process, to support them in helping to deliver to their citizens and in helping them in the earlier days of democratic development as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll associate myself with Nicole's comments. And just to add that democracy, in a vibrant democracy, those parties that are elected that fail to deliver, the electorate has the opportunity to replace them at the next election, whether it's a national election or a localized election. The problem starts to come to the forefront when candidates seek to undermine the basic foundations of any country's democracy and casts doubt on those underpinnings, which then manifests in the electorate and how the electorate deals with it at the next election.
Mm-hmm. So. I feel a bit like Ibn Battuta. I don't know if a lot of people have this reference in mind, but it's an Islamic explorer who goes all around the world. So I'm going to jump us back to Pakistan for a second. But specifically around, when we talk about the electorate having the opportunity to go back to the polls and vote, this is a very real example, a really fresh example that comes to mind. So 24 hours after the polls closed, Pakistan's Tehreek-e-Insaf chairman Imran Khan, in an AI-generated video, declared victory while sitting in jail. And his victory speech was going on at the same time that you're hearing Nawaz Sharif declare victory as well. So to me, it was just fascinating, and like this use of AI, and it has both its power to mislead in elections, but some can argue, and this was argued in a New York Times article, that this is an example of how AI can work to circumvent suppression. So I'm curious for all of you, how are you thinking about the role of AI? Nicole, you were speaking to it earlier, but I'd love to hear from each of you about the role of AI, its potential impacts, both positive and negative, related to security, related to journalism, related to democracy. Nicole, why don't you start us off with this?
Absolutely. I think artificial intelligence has the potential to do many, many great things, but it also, I think, in the context of an election, is something that we're watching, which has the tremendous power to undermine elections as well. I think that there is a responsibility both on the part of citizens and those who are educating citizens to be informed consumers of what they are seeing, so that they also recognize where there is misinformation and disinformation. I think that's an immediate thing we can start, but it's also something which we're going to have to do over a very, very long time. I think from a governmental standpoint and from the standpoint of platforms and other corporations, there is a responsibility to look at how to detect fakes, detect when there is a manipulation in images that are trying to undermine election. We've even seen in the United States the beginnings of AI-generated voices of different candidates and things like that. And I think that we, from the standpoint of election officials, from the standpoint of our government, as well as the platforms that are often where this shows up, a really big responsibility in an election year.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think in South Africa it's going to be a big issue because, of course, it's the first kind of mega election for us, and how media organizations and political parties will deal with AI. For political parties and the ANC in particular, they've come and they've used social media to actually highlight how some images are being misused, some clips are being misused. So they've actually been at the forefront of highlighting the disinformation that is happening. In Africa, Sadia, I would say, we still have a big rural-urban divide. Yeah. We still have access to information, access to the internet being limited to the cities. And what we found in Senegal last week, of course, the internet was shut down. So immediately when there's uprising, and we've seen it across Africa, in Zimbabwe, Nigeria, etc., the internet is shut down, and so then you don't have, information at all, and that's where the problem also then lies in, because then it's ripe for misinformation. And so there was a particular case study in Kenya, research done around misinformation, and we saw how that was particular around social media and when it was still Twitter, media highlighting the kind of disinformation. It was on a small scale, but of course enough to start worrying journalists about it. So I think in this year, of course, if we're going to have an election in Mauritius, in Ghana, in Mozambique, in Rwanda as well. And so, but I think the big one for us is, of course, well, for me, is South Africa. And so we already, right now it's actually not been so big, but we are fully aware as the media that it's going to be an issue. And we're starting very kind of basic around media training, being able to identify, fake news and all of it, and to become fully aware. But I think it's going to become an issue for us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think when you're talking about artificial intelligence and elections, that is another instance where government has a role. Government must have a role in order to ensure fair elections. Government has many roles, national security being one of them, and defense and all of that. But I think, especially in the United States, or in the United States, maybe not especially, the government has a role to ensure that elections are fairly executed. And then if they are, then the electorate can then have confidence in the outcome of the election.
Can I just
Yes,
jump
please.
in on just the points that both my colleagues have made? We have an opportunity, really, and candidates in every country have an opportunity to show their true colors, in the sense that there isn't an infrastructure everywhere of how elections are supposed to operate. And truthfully, regardless of the differences that different candidates may have and different views on different issues, they should both have a shared interest, or all of them should, multi-party, should have a shared interest in an election running well. And I think this is going to be the true test of those who are dedicated to democracy, if they can come together and say, we both stand against manipulation of images, we both stand against fake news, we both stand against manipulated images in any way. That's an indication that you are interested in a free and fair election. And yes, you'll debate the issues, you'll have differences of views on any number of issues, but that's where there is an integrity and a shared interest in a strong and free and fair election.
And Admiral Harris, you spoke about government playing a role. Here you're talking about those running for office wanting that. Government playing a role. If we go to South Korea is actually probably one of the more advanced nations that have already passed. So I want to say, like, last month, the South Korean Special Parliamentary Committee passed a revision to their Public Official Election Act, which calls for a ban on political campaign videos that use AI-generated deepfakes. In 2022, in the South Korean presidential election, we saw AI-generated replicas of the candidates included in their own campaign videos. I want to give you an opportunity to say something about what we're seeing in South Korea related to AI, but also more generally their election.
Yeah. So in South Korea, just for everyone's information to bring us up to the same level, this is not a presidential election year in South Korea. It's a National Assembly election, which is their Congress. The president in South Korea is elected for a single 5-year term. And so the success or failure of that president is whether her or his party gets the next president. So President Yoon is the president of South Korea now. He replaced President Moon who replaced President Park. President Park went to jail. President Moon is not in jail, and here we have President Yoon as the president of the country. Their National Assembly is of Moon's party. So Yoon is trying to govern without a majority in his party in government. Also, Yoon is experiencing popularity ratings about the lowest ever, down in the low 30s, high 20s even. And yet, even so, he's still making the U.S.-South Korea alliance the centerpiece of his foreign policy. He's taken a very hard line against threats and provocations from North Korea, and he's gone the extra mile, in my opinion, in making an outreach to Japan to try to get over the very bad relationship between Tokyo and Seoul. And he's doing this despite this abysmal approval rating from his own people. So I think that's statesmanship in action. He's doing what he thinks is the right thing. And we'll get a referendum on that probably later this year when the National Assembly elections are held. So we'll have to see how that goes.
Yes.
Sorry, I wanted to mention, I mean, the other kind of hat I sometimes wear is an election observer, part of the Commonwealth Election Observer Group. And we had a discussion in November in Ethiopia about minimum standards. I was in Eswatini, formerly known as Swaziland, the last absolute monarchy in Africa. And it was the most bizarre election because political parties are banned. And so it's candidates. And so usually when we cover an election, we go to the Electoral Commission and we could see, oh, Party A is leading, Party B. So in Eswatini, you know, that's just not happening. And so there's an argument within international election observer groups about what is the minimum standard of an election and to what extent do you then send election observers to go and observe an election? Because ultimately, when you do observe an election, you look at all sorts of indicators from the judiciary, access to the media, polling stations, political parties, etc. And, you know, to what extent, you know, does the international community then also just say, oh, Eswatini, go ahead, you don't have democracy, you don't have political parties, and we'll still give you the blessing, you know, of an election. So, and that was something that we grapple. I don't have the answer, but it is this thing of what's the minimum standard for a country, and in Eswatini's case, you know, is it just a sham election for the sake of? So that was just something that came to mind.
Yeah, this is great, and I know we just got a note here, so we're going to turn to audience questions, but I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 more questions before we do that, because I'm going to be ambitious here. For each of you, I'm curious if you could highlight a question that you think is underexplored as people think about the 2024 elections, the mega elections around the world. What is something we should be paying attention to that we aren't, whether that's in coverage, conversations like this, and conversations in the places that you all are in?
I'll jump in. I think it was mentioned already. I think the youth vote and the youth awareness and the youth participation is the thing to watch. And I say that amongst many young people in Chicago. But you have many countries where there is a very, very sizable voter base that is under 30 years old. And the question is, will those be Will that be the engine in some countries for significant democratic change, or will it be an engine for disengagement and discontent? And I think we're seeing in different places different things. And so I think the question is, the question I'll be watching in many places is how will the youth be either the engine for democratic change or democratic progress, or the engine for potentially deterioration of that progress.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, as a journalist and having worked in a public broadcaster, I do believe access to information is absolutely critical. In a country like South Africa, where we have a big rural-urban divide, people don't have a mobile phone, people don't have access to, you know, data, they don't speak English. And so for me, it's really ensuring that we make information accessible to ordinary people, whether it's through community centers, whether it's through, high mobile penetration, but people don't have data, zero, data charges. And so I really believe in an active kind of education campaign so that people can actually make informed decisions about what's on offer during an election and what political parties are offering them.
Thank you.
I think one of the things that should be explored is the unemployment in different countries and what demographic makes up the majority of the unemployed. Because that'll be a source of disaffection, which it's probably not uncommon. It may even be right to blame the ruling party or whatever for that disaffection. So if you look at that, then you might get an indication of how the election is going to go.
Thank you. I won't ask my second question because I see that we have students queued up. So thank you so much, and we'll turn to audience questions now.
Hi, I'm Alan. I'm a history major in the college. My question is, recently in many elections, particularly some of those in areas we'll not be talking, like in US, India, or places like that, but also in many places, for example, in a lot of countries in Europe, we see a rise in many right-wing conservatism. And how do you, these places, many people we have considered like as models for democracy and such, how do you think that the rise of this right-wing conservatism might kind of impact the concept of democracy around the world?
Excellent. I'm happy to jump in on that. We're seeing in a number of countries, and certainly in Europe, the rise of some right-wing parties. I think there are other places in the world where we're seeing the rise of some left-wing parties. Our concern really, and what we're watching as far as the health of democracy, is what happens also the day after the election, right? Elections are extraordinarily important. They're really the tangible, visible manifestation of democracy. But what matters the most is what happens in between those democracies as well. And the questions that the things that we'll be watching is, to what extent are there checks and balances on those parties that may have more extreme views, that may have views that are looking to take away the rights of certain groups or certain individuals in the process, and to what extent are they part of the democratic process, and to what extent are they there to undermine it, and are there sufficient checks and balances on that? So that's really what we're watching primarily.
Yeah, from an African perspective, for us, it's been what does that mean for development? What does it mean for aid? That's been obviously quite pivotal for a lot of African countries, because in most cases we've seen when right-wing governments come in, there's just kind of backslide, and Africa, the door just simply closes. So it's been quite a big concern for African nations.
Yeah, I'll just say a great question, Alan. The issue is not whether a right-wing or left-wing party gets elected. I mean, you want the population, you want the electorate to elect who they want. And if they want a right-wing party, that's their right, and that's democracy in action. The problem is what Nicole was saying, is what happens afterward. And I would say you want to look downrange to the next election. So what policies have the right-wing party, in your question's case, implemented such that it guarantees their victory the next time, which then would be an underpinning of democracy. So we have things like the Freedom Index and other indices that look and measure a country's true ability to have free and fair elections. So,
thank you.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Anand. I'm a first-year MPP student at Harris School of Public Policy. My question is, foundations of democracy and democratic political institutions are not naturally taken for granted. We have to nurture it through cultural, political movements and reforms, because it builds cultural, public morality and public ideas of ethics, which shapes our social justice and distribution of power and coexistence. So do you think that the current backslide of democratic processes and institutions throughout the world, the kind of wave that we see today, is a byproduct of parts of the Asia, parts of the Africa, or the South America? We have taken this idea of democracy from other school of thoughts, probably from Western school of thoughts, but the social and public moral ground of those communities are still not that much of fertile and supportive of democratic coexistence and democratic narrative of power sharing and mutual living. Thank you.
Thank you, Anand.
I'm happy to jump in on that. I'm a firm believer if we go to what the roots, the foundation of what democracy is, it is about giving people the voice. And when I look around the world and I think about the rights that people want to have, they want the right to be able to raise their children how they want. They want the right to worship. They want the right to not worship if they don't want to. The right to speak up, the right to choose their government, to have their government not inflict violence and pain on their society. That to me is extremely universal. And while the development of democracy very much has had its roots in one or two parts of the world, I am certain that it is something which is very much adaptable and very much something that can grow in every country and every region of the world. It will look very different. It will have different indications and different shapes because every country is different. It has different historical contexts. It has different societal and faith contexts. But I'm confident that it is a system and just the foundation of having the accountability of a government to its people and having the will of the people drive how a government acts is something that is very inherent to any society. I think part of the challenge has come when there has been external forces that have brought more than just democracy when they've come to a nation. And so I think the question is how can we support the local actors in bringing their personal and their unique flavor to democracy in allowing it to flourish in their country in their own unique way.
For me, I'm going to go back to South Africa because that's the country I was born in and I saw the change. And so for me in particular, it is our constitution. I mean, we were obviously in a position where after the fall of apartheid, we rewrote the constitution. And that allowed for us to dream the impossible, even though we have lots of contradictions, but have checks and balances, ensure that we have strong public institutions, an independent judiciary, a robust media, supporting socioeconomic rights and keeping the government in check. So it allowed for us, we had a blank check and we could rewrite what that should look like. Other countries have not had the same opportunity. And so for me, that's been important in South Africa's case, a constitution that is really there as a founding document to guide us and to really outline, where we are heading. And in South Africa's case, I think that's our kind of protector.
I'll simply add that, democracy at its core is the will of the people. But the challenge comes when you try to restrict who those people are who get the right to vote. Mm-hmm. We see that play out in the United States as well as many other countries in the world. And when you restrict the right to vote to a certain group, a certain class, a certain religion, a certain race, whatever, then your democracy is lessened by that restriction.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. My name's Chuka. I'm a medical student, so I will say I'm definitely not in my realm here. But I just want to thank you for being here. My question is sort of this idea you talked about democracy delivering and sort of this disillusionment, right? And, as I was thinking about how familiarity sometimes can rob us of wonder, right? And we're seeing this in America. And so my question is to you all, what do you feel that America can learn from other countries and how they're doing their elections? And we can sort of partake that this year. Mm-hmm.
Mm. I think we're in a moment of particular polarization in the United States that is extraordinarily damaging to our democracy. And there are many other democracies around the world that have similar diversity of views, similar diversity of its population, and they are managing to get through their elections without the polarization, without the dehumanization of opponents, without the undermining of the validity of other views, not the agreement with other views, but the validity that there can be other views and that pluralism is a strength. I think that's something that the United States can certainly look around the world and say, how is it that other diverse nations, other nations that have a wide political spectrum is managing to get through an election, honor the diversity of views, but also do it in a way which honors the democracy without tearing it down?
Chuka, the view from the South is that, I mean, I think we just shocked at, how things are unfolding, that you have two kind of main political parties slugging it all out. I mean, as I said, in South Africa, we have 356 parties and counting.
Some.
Yeah, you can have some. And so as much as, as I said, 30 years into democracy, we are, kind of embracing multi-party democracy and different views. And we've always had it because our constitution safeguarded to ensure that we have different political parties. And so I often wonder what would that look like in the US if you had other political parties emerging, and what would that mean for the country?
There are a lot of tactical or technical lessons we can learn from other countries. There are countries in Asia that you can't start campaigning until a certain date. In the United States, we'd never stop campaigning, right? So that's a lesson you can learn. In other countries, they end campaigning within a certain number of days before the election, so that the electorate, in theory, can think about who they're going to vote for without the constant barrage of ads and robocalls and all of that. Unlike in the United States, when they're going to try to get you to vote even after you voted, right? So you're going to continue to have that. So those are kind of practical, tactical lessons that I think that we can learn. We can also learn. This is the 21st century. This is not the 19th century. You don't have to physically be there to vote. I mean, I can get my driver's license renewed in Colorado online. Why can't you vote online everywhere in the United States, for example? I can do my banking online, all those checks and balances in order to do some banking, monetary transfer of funds and all that. If that can be trusted to the internet, then why can't we set up a system where you can vote electronically as well? Yeah.
And I'll just add, sorry, did you complete that? I would just add that as a research center that studies reform, we are often looking abroad as well. So whether that's proportional representation, compulsory voting, public funding of elections, it's something that we're doing here at the Harris School as well. So I also got a note that we're going to try to get through as many questions as possible. So students, if you come up and maybe we could take one or two responses for each question, please.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm not a student. I'm actually a program coordinator at the Institute of Politics for the Fellows Program and the Speaker Series. So on behalf of staff, thank you so much for being here. My question is mainly for Admiral Harris, but anyone is welcome to jump in. You mentioned earlier that within the Senate, Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan are all grouped together in a bill where they're going to be receiving aid from the United States. My question is, a little tall. My question is, why are these three regions grouped together? What is the thread of U.S. interest in all of them?
Yeah, so the thread of U.S. interest is that each of these countries, regions, you can debate me on whether Taiwan is a country or not, but I'll say it just for simplicity. Each of the countries, there is a clear U.S., in my opinion, there is a clear U.S. Interest in outcomes of the conflicts that they face, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Russia on Ukraine, Hamas on Israel, or China on Taiwan. So that sort of connects the three. They are also recipients of large amounts of U.S. assistance, whether that assistance is monetary assistance or aid or military assistance or whatever. And we have significant national interests in what happens in Israel, what happens in Ukraine because of Russia, and what happens in Asia because of Taiwan. So that's what lumps the three together. They're not naturally alike, but the nexus of those three countries with regard to U.S. national interests does draw that clear thread. Now, originally, it wasn't just the three countries in the aid. Originally, it was the question of the southern border and the three countries. So the southern border part the immigration part was taken out. And so, thanks to the Senate for continuing to try to push for the aid to these three countries that need our aid desperately, or need our assistance desperately.
Thank you. Abby?
Hi there. Once again, thank you so much. I really appreciate being allowed to introduce you. It's an honor. So I really liked hearing your discussion on democracy, and I wanted to mention a geographical region that hasn't really been brought up, especially since it doesn't have any major elections in this year specifically. But we've heard many claims recently, especially amongst recent events, that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. But considering the events even before October 7th and protests against Netanyahu's government, what do you make of the claim of Israel's democratic standing? And what do you think the future of Netanyahu's government looks like? Thank you.
I would say that Israel is the only electoral democracy in the region. I think that's a factual statement, but there's no doubt that well before October 7th, there was really significant problems. And I think Netanyahu had made an effort to limit the power of the Supreme Court to have checks and balances, and you saw a very strong Israeli civil society response to that. So I think that there were some challenges within Israeli democracy that is just inherent to Israeli democracy. It's not something related directly to October 6th, to October 7th. There are some other countries in the region that are having elections. Iran, if we have the broader region, is having an election. It will not be free and fair. I think that what you see across the Middle East is a lot of civil society actors that are really looking for democratic change or looking for openings and protection of their rights, and a lot of governments that have not provided that opening yet. And we're hopeful that those civil society actors can push for change and can really push to open it up and to have some more democratic rights protected for people in the region.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you guys for being here tonight. My name is Juan. I'm a third year at the college, and my question is where the other side of that, that is a country that pretty much literally right now is having elections. That is Indonesia. Literally in a few hours, the polls should be opening up throughout the many islands. So my question is, what takeaways, what points to watch do you all have for us? And additionally, what challenges do the many parties and candidates vying for to be elected have to face in order for to continue promoting a development of the country?
I'll take that.
Indonesia.
Yeah, so Indonesia is having their elections today or tomorrow, for the 14th, depending on which side of the date line you're on. World's largest Muslim country, a great friend of the United States. I think our obligation is to support the democratic process in Indonesia, but it's up to the Indonesians to elect the leaders that they want. And we have to ensure that that's, well, I say we have to ensure, we don't have to ensure it, but that's the side that we should take going into the elections so that we're not being seen as trying to unduly influence the will of the Indonesian people.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, Juan, I did not know Indonesia was heading to the election, so thank you. It's not often that I'm don't know things. But I mean, Indonesia for South Africa and Africa has been interesting because the recent BRICS summit, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, Indonesia was invited to become a BRICS member, but it declined because it said it needed to engage domestically first before it kind of signs up to the BRICS +5 that we have now. And so I thought that was interesting because all the other countries that were invited to the BRICS immediately said yes, whereas Indonesia actually said, no, we've got domestic issues to focus on, which i.e. meant they were focusing on the election. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Right. My name's Hugh. I'm also a third year in the college, and I guess I want to go back to the other side of the world. I'm wondering particularly about El Salvador, a country where I guess the president, he's had a great deal of success delivering on his campaign promises while, I guess, putting civil rights, checks and balances aside. So I'm just wondering what you make of what's going on there, and specifically what countries like South Africa and other similar countries that are beset with a lot of violence, what their chances of, I guess, going a similar route of El Salvador are.
Excellent. Obviously, we have seen Bukele delivering on his campaign promises. That's a great way to speak about his leadership. But he has had a brutal crackdown on a lot of people. And while he is addressing a very real security concern, there's a lot of concerns that he is rolling back democratic processes and democratic values in that. I think that there is a real opportunity in many countries, and I would say El Salvador is one, Ecuador is another, Mexico, a number of other countries, I'm sure there's some other examples, of showing that security and cracking down on very real gang and non-state violence can be done with democratic principles, and that when there is any rollback, a leader has a responsibility to explain why the rollback and how long that rollback will exist, because it can't be a permanent rollback. And that's what we're very concerned about with Bukele, that he is rolling it back for good. They're not mutually exclusive, and that's the challenge that I think leaders will have to show, can they promote democracy, withhold those values, and then also secure their people at the same time.
He's going to be reelected, even though I don't think he's supposed to run again. I think the law says only a single term in El Sal. Not sure, though.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Seth Poling, second year at the college. Thank you for being here. My question is for you, Admiral Harris. Could you talk to us about your role as Indo-PACOM commander in securing the Taiwan Strait and protecting U.S. national interests in the Indo-Pacific? And talk to us a little bit about what your role and future commanders' roles are in securing and protecting Taiwan's democracy.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so it's a great question. I don't want to get pedantic and get into it, but just for everyone's information, Indo-PACOM is one of the regional geographic combatant commands in the U.S. military system. It's the largest combatant command and the oldest. The area of responsibility, we used to say, was Hollywood to Bollywood and polar bears to penguins. So it covers 52% of the globe. To the specific question on Taiwan, there are plans in place to help Taiwan defend itself, but Indo-PACOM, like any other combatant command, like anyone else in the military, it doesn't act unilaterally, right? So it has to be ordered by the National Command Authority, by the President, through the Secretary of Defense, to the combatant commander. And even then, it's not an independent Indo-PACOM thing only. There's Cybercom would be involved, Space Command, and the other services and other combatant commands as well. Because part of Indo-PACOM's area of responsibility is borders rather on European Command, right? Russia, and then it borders on Central Command, the North Arabian Sea, India. India is in Indo-Pacific Command. Pakistan is in Central Command. And so those areas of coordination have to be worked. But the fundamental issue is not one of, is that Indo-PACOM won't act unilaterally, so that the responsibility for defending our treaty allies in the Indo-Pacific, we only have 5 bilateral treaty allies in the whole world, and they're all in the Indo-Pacific, bilateral defense treaty allies, and helping Taiwan will come as an outcome of an order from the President.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Noel. I'm a first year at the college. I wanted to ask you, Ms. Seda, but anyone else can jump in. Going back to Alan's question at the beginning about the rise of the far right, one thing that I think we've seen with the decline of social trust is that opposition to the far right and opposition to these anti-governmental authoritarian parties has been concentrated in these like multi-party charters, like in South Africa, for example, but in Turkey you have the CHP unifying all the parties. In Hungary you have the multi-party alliance. And often it's failed because they've failed to present a comprehensive vision of what life without Fidesz, life without all these semi-authoritarian parties looks like. And what can the opposition do in an era of decreasing social trust to present a vision that actually is convincing for the average voter that something will change when the ruling party leaves?
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Do you want to take the other question? Or
Yeah, let's take the other question as well, and then we can respond to both together.
Yeah.
Actually, mine is kind of related.
Great.
I'm Pavlik. I'm a second year at the college. Roughly speaking, you practically the first question in this was, first answer to the first question was that for 17 years, there's been democratic decline. I am 19 years old. It is very easy in the news to see something that looks like democratic decline. It is very easy to look at something and say, oh, an election was postponed. Oh, there was a military coup. Oh, this election is a sham, whatever. It's very difficult to imagine what it means for a democracy to build, especially since for my entire life, the world has seen progressive democratic decline. So kind of in the same vein, what can be done to push back against democratic decline, and sort of how has it not worked for the last 17 years? And second of all, what does it look like and what indicators can be looked at that show that, oh, look, democracy is getting better here?
So we have 20 seconds left. Nicole,
I'm going to give a real quick. I
Yes.
think that coalitions have an opportunity to distinguish themselves from authoritarian-leaning governments and parties by showing a compelling vision for what democracy looks like, for how you actually bring people in. Under a democracy, you can disagree on a lot of things, but there is a way that you all can work together for the country moving forward under a democratic mantle. If you want to know the indicators for how it changes, our report is coming out on February 29th, but it really is looking at all of those indicators of democracy and seeing how those are built in a society, and I'm very confident that it's possible. In a country like the United States, our decline has not brought us down to a place of non-democracy. It means that we're fraying around the edges, and we have an opportunity to return that back by strengthening the very principles of democracy.
And with that, I want to thank our audience for joining us tonight. I want to thank our esteemed panelists for sharing their expertise. And I want to remind you all that there's food upstairs. So join us for some refreshments. Thank you.